Aaron Berkowitz back here with the Jewish Literary Journal, and Jill Santopolo, who is the New York Times and internationally bestselling author of The Light We Lost, More Than Words, Everything After, and the upcoming Stars in an Italian Sky. Her books have been translated into 35 languages, and The Light We Lost, which was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick, was also optioned for film. Welcome, Jill. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So, my pleasure. First question is, why this book at this time?
Why Stars in Italian Sky?
Yes.
So this was a book I started writing during the pandemic. My husband and I are both have one Jewish parent and one Italian Catholic parent. And we had gone to Italy on our honeymoon in the summer of 2019. And I was finishing up writing my previous book, Everything After, up until literally like the month that everything was under lockdown in New York and DC, where we were going back and forth. And I wanted to start a new book, and I wanted to escape the world we were living in. So I was thinking about all of the experiences we had had in Italy, and we had spent a lot of time with Andrew's family. Andrew's my husband, sorry. And they are descended from nobility. One of his cousins or their family was the Marchese of Rocca de Baldi and the Count of Saluzzo. And we'd had a long conversation about nobility in Italy and how in 1946 there was this institutional referendum and the country voted. It was the very first time women could vote in Italy, which was very cool. And the country voted basically to end the monarchy and with it the nobility. And everyone who was part of the nobility's lives changed dramatically. And I just thought how interesting it must have been to be living in those times and to expect your life to go one way, and then all of a sudden your life was going an entirely different way through, nothing you did or didn't do, just because there was this vote and that's what happened. And as we were living through the pandemic, as I said, I wanted to sort of escape our reality and try on another reality. And also, I was thinking about the fact that all of us, our lives kind of changed dramatically because of things out of our own control. So it just seemed like the kind of book I wanted to be writing at that time. And because I like playing with time and I like families and I like generations and I like seeing how the past affects the future, I decided I wanted one part of the story to take place in 1946 in Italy, right around the institutional referendum. And then I wanted another part of the story to take place in New York City in 2017, pre-pandemic, and be the later generations of that same family, so that you could sort of see how things changed, how things didn't change, how the past affected the future in these families. So I guess that's why I wrote this book at this particular time. It felt like the kind of book I needed to write while we weren't able to go anywhere or do pretty much anything.
Sure. I think it's also interesting that you have complementary storylines. Talk to me about, like, is it writing one storyline incomplete and then you go to the second storyline? Is it back and forth? Do the details change depending on how it's sort of going in a different timeline?
What's so interesting is I wrote it going back and forth. So I was like, all right, I want to make sure like this thing happened in the past section. So now in this next present section, I want to bring that, piece of jewelry or that painting or that whatever it is, so that like you can sort of see how the past is still present. But then when I revised it, I actually pulled the entire book apart and I revised the entire historical piece as a unit, and I revised the entire present piece as a unit, and then I put them back together again, and then revised the whole thing as a like complete work. And it was really interesting because there were definitely things where I was like, if I read this as one story without the pieces in between, it actually is missing things. So I added a lot in both sections to sort of deepen it and make it feel a little more connected in and of its own self before putting it back together.
Yeah, it's interesting to think around sort of when we're competing, not competing, but having two different stories, how one, a word sometimes translates across, but then you sort of lose the thread within the original story to a degree, I would imagine. Something you brought up was sort of a mixed family, and sort of this is mixing times, and I guess along the lines of the nobility sort of issue, like how things shift or identities kind of change. How did that sort of interplay with the characters in the book?
So so a sort of bit more about my biography and my husband's biography is that, so his family was part of the nobility. My family on the Italian side were shoemakers from southern Italy, so not in the same circles. So one of the things that I thought about while we were there was how our relationship likely wouldn't have happened if we were both sort of members of our family back then. Like they just wouldn't have been traveling in the same circles unless, the noble went to the shoemaker, right, to have their shoes made or something. So I kind of was imagining like what that would be like if it were the two of us, but we were in our families in 1946 in Italy. So that sort of mixing, I think was really interesting. And I actually write in a previous book that I wrote in More Than Words, I pulled a lot on sort of feeling like I'm from a mixed family, and the two main characters in that book have parents from different places, and sort of they really talk about their identity and whether they feel like more one thing or more another thing, or whether you can be a chameleon, or whether you feel like nothing at all because you don't feel whole with anything. So that's sort of the book where I really explored that identity. And my husband and I have talked a lot about it too, and I think we both feel differently. And I think, based on, I guess, our personalities or how we were raised, or how our parents sort of navigated that.
But I also think in this book you have also distinct times and places, so that you're mixing also between, it's not just characters that are mixing, or a narrative around characters, also around place and time. So that might, when you're thinking of like 1946 Italy, obviously you were in Italy, but how much research do you have to do to sort of capture a new country in a different time?
I did quite a bit. And then I had a phenomenal Italian editor who helped me out a lot as well. But I spoke to a bunch of people whose parents were alive in Italy at that time, and sort of they gave me some details on what their lives were like, what it was like there. And then I read a bunch of books. I watched a bunch of videos. There are some really cool like history professors in Italy who make videos about what Italy was like at different time periods. So I watched a bunch of those, and I reached out to one of them and I was like, hey, I'm writing a book about Italy. Is there any chance you could answer some questions for me? And she was like, yeah, absolutely. So I spoke to her a bit, and then I did a lot of Google searching and, looking for reliable sources online, of course, but like I would come up to a question where I was like, was makeup readily available in 1946 in Italy with all of the sort of wartime supply chain issues? And the answer was not really. So then I was like, well, what did women do instead? And then I went down an entire rabbit hole of, how women made their own makeup during wartime, during World War II. So I had a lot of fun kind of coming up with like, in the middle of writing, being like, wait, I have this question. Can I find the answer to this? And then, 3 hours later, I could write my one sentence, but I now know a lot more about,
It's
some
so
random topic.
I was working on a book, and I was writing about medicine, and then I realized I was using modern medicine as like a reference point, and it was like this was 1950 whatever, and it was like, oh, they don't
That's
have
very
these
different.
machines, they don't have these tests, and what they would be talking about would be a completely different content. And you have to like remind yourself that there's a lot of moving parts to every little thing that somebody would do 20 years ago, 30
Yeah.
years ago, 100 years ago, that you sort of have to research. I think people, when I originally, start fiction, you're like, oh, I'll just write a story, and then you're like in a time and place, and you're like, oh, I can't just make it up. That
Right.
doesn't make, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't
No,
change.
absolutely. I mean, one of the main characters in the past story is the daughter of a tailor, and she herself is also a tailor, and she designs clothing. And I was like, all right, here we go, deep dive into, styles of 1946, particularly in Italy and around the world. And that was really interesting to learn about too, because I was like, all right, she has to be kind of cool, because she's designing the clothes. She has to be at the forefront of style. So what magazines would she read? What magazines were available? What magazines were still being printed? So
Do you speak Italian?
a bit. I'm
That must
definitely
be,
not fluent, but enough that I could get through a book, or get through a paper if I needed to get some information from it.
I was gonna say, if you're trying to get because also like the other thing with history is you can always find sort of the, let's say, American perspective, but that if you're trying to get the other side, you have to, oftentimes that involves other languages or sort of
Yeah.
other resources that perhaps are less accessible to people who don't speak that language. So it's a very interesting thing to think of historical fiction as sort of an act of research. I feel like that's not often talked about.
Yeah, but it fully is. I mean, if you want it to feel authentic, right? If you want someone who lived during that time to pick it up. I also, my grandmother, not my Italian grandmother, but my other grandmother, she is still around, and she was around then, so she's 91 now. And I called her and I was like, Graham, what did people do if they wanted to put their hair in a ponytail? Like, were there hair elastics? What did you do? She was like, I think we used rubber bands and then tied ribbons around them. And I was like, all right, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. I once had a writing mentor be like, that's the job, is to like figure out the little detail. That little detail is really what will sell the overall sort of reliability or truthfulness of the story.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I know this is your fourth book. Something that comes up a lot with our readers is sort of the publishing process. Can you walk me through that? Is it you have an agent, I assume, and you sort of pitch them a book, you write the book, then you pitch it? Like, how does that sort of work?
So I guess the first book is different than the fourth book. I think for this book, I have an editor who I adore. Her name is Tara Singh Carlson. She works at Putnam. And, I was hoping that she would want this book too. So I came up with a concept. I wrote, I think, about maybe 50 pages or so. And I gave them to my agent, who gave me notes, and I adjusted the pages and then sent those pages to Tara. And I was like, all right, this is the beginning. And then also here's a summary, a synopsis of where this whole thing is going. Are you interested? So I think it was from those 50 pages and then a detailed summary of the rest of the book that then she agreed to take on the project. And then I'm a little bit, I guess, of a slowish writer. Some people are slower than me, some people are faster, but it took me about not quite 2 years, almost 2 years to finish the book.
Interesting. Yeah, I think people just oftentimes the publishing world seems the writing process people sort of understand, but the publishing world seems very elusive for a lot of people, at least as I speak to them or hear from them. That's often sort of like, oh, the agenting, and then how do you sort of get from point A to point B? So it's interesting
Yeah.
to see how it evolves over time.
Yeah, I mean, for the first book I wrote, for The Light We Lost, I wrote the entire book first, and then revised it a bunch of times with my agent before she went out with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know also you write children's literature. How does that sort of, I think people often see the distinction like, oh, I write adult work or I write children work, and how do you sort of get between those two?
So after my first adult book, I've put a pause on the children's writing, just because I don't have the time, like I said before, a little slow. So I haven't been doing both at the same time in a while. But for first adult book, I was finishing up a children's series that that I was doing with Simon and Schuster. It was an intellectual property deal, so they came up with the idea and they hired me to be the pen, which is a lot of fun. It's like someone gives you a cool writing assignment and then you get to play inside it. So I was writing the last couple books of that series while I was working on the adult book. And what's interesting is I feel like there's a huge similarity, at least for me, in process, in that I try to sort of inhabit the character in a way so that if I'm writing from the point of view of a 10-year-old, what I'm thinking about are words I would have used or a contemporary 10-year-old would use now, or experiences you have up until you're about 10, and what you would pull from as like an image or an example or a comparison, or how you would do something or say something up until you were 10. And then when I was writing from the perspective of a 35-year-old, or actually I think the first book, she's 33, but I was like, all right, what language, what experiences, what images, what metaphors, what would she say? How would she respond to this kind of a situation? So like, I did a whole bunch of theater when I was up through college, a little bit after, and I think the character development of creating a character for a show is very similar to creating a character in fiction and creating a narrative voice and sort of saying, all right, this is the backstory, this is this person's backstory, this is the education they have, this is the town they live in, this is where they grew up. Like, what would they say? How would they say this? How would they respond to this? And I think that's the same for children and adults.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's the classic advice, is to like write the biography. I don't know. I've always had personal trouble with that when I'm working on things. I kind of let the story dictate probably more than I should. I don't know. I think I have a general outline of character, but then maybe I don't know. Maybe does the research like affect the way you see the character? For example, for your latest book, sort of as you're doing the research, you shift the character sort of core. Or there's a core that always stays true, and then certain details shift, but the core stays the same.
I think like I knew when I was writing. So the two characters, Vincenzo and Giovanna, are the 1946 characters, and I knew Vincenzo grew up in a winery, like that his father made wine. I knew that this was he had this specific story for his experience during World War II. I knew that his brother died in the war. I knew that he was an artist. I knew that his family felt really strongly about the referendum, the nobility sort of staying around after the referendum, and that was important to them. And sort of coming up with all of that, like, made me understand how he would respond to a situation I put him in. So I always feel like once, like, character builds plot for me, in that, like, because I've created this character, the story is shaped this way because of this person who I created would have this response.
Yeah. I guess that's sort of, that's what would change any story, right? Is at the end of the day, World War II happened to a lot of people, but what shifts is, of course, the experience of that person, and then how they react. I guess that would be the same.
Yeah. And I did a lot of research because I hadn't known a ton about what happened to Jewish Italians. And so I did a ton of research on that, and I figured out how I could work that in, and how I could just sort of weave a tapestry of what it was like back then, for an entire community to experience war, and how they all experienced it slightly differently. The people who stayed in Genoa were different than the people who went to the country, or the people who, decided to work, to fight with the partisans were different than the people who were fighting, with the Italian army. Or there were people who went into the Italian army and then, at a certain point shifted their allegiance to the partisans. So
Yeah, I mean, the choices that it's interesting also, like post-war, how the different Jews sort of matched up their stories with each other, and sort of created hierarchy based on like, oh, I experienced this, or you experience, and how it's a very interesting sort of process around trauma and experience as to like how your choices within those you would sort of see yourself as a positive or negative, or sort of higher or lower in the social order. And that's interesting, I guess, with the nobility thing again, like how much do we get to dictate within the context, or versus how much is decided for us by the context.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So is there another book on the way, or you take a break? How does that sort of work for you?
There's always another book on the way, right? Yeah, I started writing a book that's been shifting a lot. I wanted to do a kind of time jump again because I had a lot of fun with that. And I initially was thinking like maybe I would do it to like both in New York City, but 2 different time periods in New York City. But then the concept I came up with, it like wasn't really working right. So I was like, well, maybe I'll go back to Italy. That was fun. So actually in this book, I think it's actually the very first time I've ever written characters who are, their father is Jewish and their mother is Italian in this book. In my family, it's actually swapped, but so I've sort of been having fun kind of using the details of that experience in this. And this is also the first book I've written about 3 sisters, and I have 2 sisters. So I feel like I've been pulling some fun stuff.
Yeah.
So the rest of the story, I mean, the characters aren't us and all have very different jobs and different life experiences, but
Yeah, I mean, it's a very hard line, a very hard line to sort of separate art from artist, let's say, in this case, where how much do you put of yourself within the work versus how much, is constructed. I think it's especially if people read your work that they can see themselves and they're like, oh, how much are you taking of me and putting in here?
Yeah. Yeah, and I always say like I never take any one human, but I would and my characters don't necessarily think or feel about a situation the way I think or feel about it, even if we have the same experience. But there are definitely like details that I think I pull from real life just so that things feel authentic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The first time I did something and my wife saw herself, she was like, what's this? And I was like, no, it's not you. It's kind of like you, you have to sort of make that very clear. I remember learning that concept, somewhere in my MFA, like, how to really separate the speaker from the poet. And that was like a big emphasis of like, especially when you're critiquing somebody else's work or you're reading somebody else in the class, in the workshop's work, and you have to separate who's writing it and what's on the page.
Yeah. For my first book, The Light We Lost, I also read the audiobook. So anyone who comes and hears me talk and has listened to the audiobook is always like, oh my God, you're Lucy. And then I think there's something that like clicks where they're like, wait, how much is she Lucy? And, people were like, so how are your kids? And Lucy has 2 kids and I have 1 kid. So it's sort of like, and I didn't have any kids when I wrote about Lucy. So I feel like there's really a conflation that happens, particularly because of the audiobook.
That is something I would not have thought, but yeah, I guess it makes sense. It's just, that is super interesting that you impose what you're hearing. It's like that movie Her, where part of what worked was that it was Scarlett Johansson's voice that Joaquin Phoenix was listening to the whole time. I think that was, if it's somebody's voice that you sort of recognize, you impose a character on that, something human about, you hear somebody and then you build character from there as well.
It's like Llama Llama's mom in the Llama Llama cartoon is Jennifer Garner. Now you know how old the kid is. So when I always like, you see the Llama Llama mom, but you think Jennifer Garner because you hear her voice.
Yeah, it's interesting how we sort of have disparate parts of the brain working at the same time, and the confusion, or sort of, I guess it elicits excitement in the readers when they sort of figure that their character comes to life a little bit.
Yeah,
that's cool. Well, it sounds like a really interesting book. I'm curious as to if it ends up in New York or sort of Italy, but I do think that mixing of identity again across time is an interesting sort of concept again, because of the multifactorial sort of way of approaching identity that must be born of such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think identity is a huge theme for me in general, but I think particularly in the book that I'm working on right now. And sort of how different people with the same background can identify differently, and choose which parts of their identity are going to be the ones that they take real ownership of.
Yeah. I guess it's sort of an interesting comment on sort of marrying from your own tribe, or so to speak, right? That at the end of the day, there is no such thing. Two people with a similar background can have very completely different sort of philosophies around that background, and what they choose again to do. That it's a much more complex thing than just sort of looking at the page as to where we match up, kind of.
Yeah.
Do you think of yourself as like a romance writer, or I know you obviously you're dealing a lot with relationships and things, or do you sort of find yourself in a different genre? Do you not like that categorization?
I don't mind that categorization if it helps people who would like my book find my book. But I think that romance novels tend to have tropes that my books don't. I don't always have a happily ever after. And I think more what I write about is love in all its forms. Romantic love, of course, but also familial love, siblings, parents, children, the love that friends share, grandparents and grandchildren I write a lot about. And I think to me, at least, love is one of those common denominators that humanity, like anyone who is part of humanity, can relate to. And when The Light We Lost was first going out into the world, and it started getting sold in a whole bunch of different countries, and I would get letters from the different publishers who wanted to publish the book, and they would all say things like, "This book made me remember my own first love," or "I also lost somebody that I loved, and this reminded me of that," or just sort of various iterations of like, "I saw myself in the love that you wrote about." And it was kind of amazing to me because I felt like these were people who were from all different countries, grew up speaking all different languages, practicing different religions, with different backgrounds, but they all connected to love, they all connected to loss. And like that those feelings are so universal and are just bigger than any one group of people. And that's something that I thought was really really powerful. And it's definitely something that I keep coming back to, just how we all love.
That's better than I could say it, I'm sure. But I do appreciate that the distinction between sort of like the Shakespearean comedy aspect of romance, and then versus like a more realistic appreciation of love itself. And I'm sure we have that to look forward to in the new book. As we wrap up, where can people find you and your work if they're interested?
So you can find me. My website is jillsantopolo.com, and I often hang out on Instagram at Jill Santopolo. I do have Twitter. I never use it. And I have a Facebook page that I use a little bit more, Jill Santopolo author. You can find me there. There's also an events page right now on my website because I'm going on the road, because Stars in Italian Sky is coming out on the 28th of February, and I will be in DC, New York, South Carolina, a few different places in Florida, Pennsylvania, and doing a couple of virtual events. So if you're interested in hearing more, you can find my event schedule there. And the book should be available wherever books are sold.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and taking time out of your schedule to be with us. I really appreciate it. And good luck with the book.
Thank you so much. It was really fun to talk to you.